Well, hey guys, Mr. Delcor back again for a little more remote learning. We're going to start thinking, now that we're done with our tree identification part of the class, we're going to move on and start looking at Maine's lumber industry, kind of past and present. We'll spend a little bit of time on that. Just a heads up, if you hear some beautiful chirping in the background today during the lesson, I'm sitting next to my brooder box with 5 little baby chicks in it. These are my laying hens. We should be getting eggs here in September or so. Pretty exciting stuff. Just got them the other day. So right now we in the brooder box we've got Blueberry, we've got Pancake, we've got Diamond, we've got Sunshine, and who else is in there? I'm missing somebody. Hang on. Geez, I don't even know. Scarlett's changed their names a whole bunch. So yeah. All right, back to the lesson here. Let's talk about logging. This is pretty interesting stuff here. Maine's logging industry is a big-time tradition, and a lot of what we eat in Maine today and a lot of the way we speak today really harkens back to this time, and a lot of people don't realize it. It's really, really cool stuff. If we think about our lumber industry, it began right about the time of settlement. It was a very traditional way of work in Maine. The image you see there on this screen is of a guy cutting up. He's got a partner on the other side of that saw, and they're cutting up a gigantic eastern white pine, probably into 8-foot or 16-foot sections there. That'll get brought to a river. We'll talk more about that later. But yeah, so our forest industry began really early, 250, 300 years ago. And really a traditional way of life in Maine would have been for men to work in the woods all winter, like literally gone for the winter working in the woods. And then they would have arrived home in the spring, and they would have farmed on their land, subsistence farming, for the entire summer and early fall. And the wives would have been really hard at work helping on the farm during the winter, running things by themselves, but also all summer long preserving food, canning as much as they could get into their cupboards so that they could make it through the winter off everything they had grown in their fields. So really subsistence lifestyle for a long, long time. That's how Mainers lived. So let's get right down to it here. I mean, some of these pictures from the old logging days are just amazing. And the guy there on the left, he's got a special tool called a peavey and a double-bitted axe there over his shoulder. And I just may start dressing like that guy. That hat is just amazing, and just really cool stuff. If you look over there on the right, you can see a couple different logging camps. So look inside there, and then everybody posing there out front. And you can see just how many people it took to run a logging camp. You can see the cooks and the cookee, the guy who would have delivered the food to them, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And all those folks, it took manpower. This was not mechanized in any way. It was all hand tools and livestock. For a couple hundred years doing this. And these guys lived in this tiny little dark cabin. They worked basically all daylight hours. They would come back at night to eat and sleep, and that was about it. They're sitting all on the lower right-hand corner there on a long bench, or a long bed, and they would have all slept in that same really long bed with one really, really long blanket that would have been a series of quilts all sewn together to make a super long blanket. So these dudes... they were close acquaintances. I mean, they slept in the same bed every night to stay warm in these really cold logging camps. And they would have cut wood all winter in these camps because that's when the ground was frozen. That's when they could move this the easiest over the top of snow using sleds and things like that. And also they were trying to get the wood to nearby rivers or frozen lakes so that they could do a log drive in the spring, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So winter time was when they were doing all this work, and it would have been really, really cold back then doing that work outside all day. So a few important tools of the trade back then. Number one would have been the axe early on. The early days, it was only axes, and they would have chopped these trees down and then bucked the logs, taking all the branches off of them by hand using an axe. Later on down the road came the cross-cut saw, where you've got 2 guys, one on each side, kind of sawing away on a tree, but they still would have used axes to buck the logs and remove all the branches. And then there's some really cool tools that were kind of developed here in Maine that we see used all over the world now. One's called a peavey, and I grew up using a peavey in my yard, moving logs around with my dad, cutting firewood, and no idea at the time the historical significance of that tool. And then a pick pole as well, which would have come in handy on the drive. So if we look here, we can see those tools down at the bottom right. Obviously the felling axe they would have used to cut the trees down, and then a cross-cut saw there in the upper right-hand corner, where 2 men would have used to saw these trees down. And then that really cool tool there on the left is called a peavey, and that would have been used to roll logs. You could take a really big, heavy log, and using that long handle and the hooked arm that kind of hinges. You can get a hold of that log and you can roll a really big heavy log over with almost no effort at all. And it's a pretty great example of how humans figured out some of the physics around moving big heavy objects through logging, and found a way to use kind of science and leverage and to get really big heavy things out of the woods without a whole lot of machinery. Just really, really cool. These people were super smart and very ingenuitive. They had to do everything on their own and figure out all this stuff. So there was a lot of heavy lifting to be done. This was a very manual job. The logs would have been twitched. That's the term we would use, a twitch trail. We would twitch the logs. We would drag them out of the woods using horses in this case, and also oxen. And everything else was done with manpower, people, lifting and pulling and pushing and doing all this and burning tons and tons of calories. And if you think about it, one of the coolest things to me looking back at this is how important food and hay were to this whole operation. There was no diesel fuel needed because there was no machinery. Back then you had to feed the people really calorie-rich diets of donuts and bread and all kinds of stuff. And you'll see that in the movie we're going to watch next class. What these guys eat is just amazing. They fed them all day long, 4 meals a day. They would have had breakfast, first lunch, second lunch, and then dinner. And they had huge caloric intakes, but that was basically to fuel them. They were the machinery, these men. And then obviously the horses and oxen were fed hay. And hay was extremely important because that's the fuel for your heavy machinery. So just a really interesting way to look at things. And none of these guys are ever overweight. All these pictures, they're all skinny. They all ate like 5,000 calories a day or something crazy, probably higher than that when you look back at all the different food they were eating all day long. So they would have, as we mentioned earlier, they would have cut wood in the winter, and they were doing that because the ground was frozen. They could move the wood around on the snow a little bit easier using sleds. You can see those horses are towing a big sled there with all kinds of logs on it. And then the whole idea would have been to get all that wood onto a frozen river or a frozen lake all winter long, piling it up on the edge of this river or even on the frozen river. And then when spring came and all this melts, that wood is all of a sudden in the water and it's flowing downstream. All of the mills were built along rivers for a couple reasons. You can use the power in the river to run your mill, and the wood's coming down the river, it'll get brought right to the mill. It's kind of a perfect system there. So they would have used the river to transport all of this wood down to the mills, and they would have done log drives to do this. So the loggers would have gone into the woods by paddling upstream in the fall, and they would emerge in the spring with the log drive. They would be riding the logs down the river, camping along the way, all the way to the mill, and you can see a bunch of guys there working to prevent a log jam from happening on the corner of that river. That's a very deadly, dangerous job, and lots of men died doing this job. That log drive was extremely dangerous, and even the cutting and moving of the logs was super dangerous too. It's worth stopping to mention how many lives were lost in the Maine woods. This was super dangerous work. So that spring flood, all that snow melt would have helped to get those rivers really high and raging, and it would have helped to move all that wood downstream. But we also built dams all up and down our rivers to help control the water levels. They would close a dam, raise the water way up, fill the reservoir behind the dam with logs, and then let it all go at once and run those logs down to the next lake or impoundment in the river. So just a really cool, ingenious system. We did it for a long time until about the 1970s, when the Environmental Protection Agency finally put an end to river driving because it was so detrimental to the environment. I mean, you think about all that wood in the river, the habitat destruction that occurred. The rivers were straightened to make this work better. A lot of rocks were removed from the rivers, which provided habitat for a lot of fish. And really, nature and the natural world took a backseat to mankind for a long time. And it wasn't until our environmental awakening in the 60s and 70s that we started banning some of these practices. Now, a lot of people might argue with you that banning that log drive might not have been so good for the North Maine woods, because as soon as they banned the log drives, we had roads built everywhere in the North Maine woods, which allowed more human access and really changed the landscape more so than the river driving ever did. There were no roads in the North Maine woods really to speak of at all until the 1970s, when all of a sudden these guys couldn't run wood down the rivers anymore, and they had to build dirt roads way back in there to get all of their lumber out. So just an example of the way we help the environment, but there's never a silver bullet. But here's some more images. The one on the far left here is actually of the Saco River. That's a log drive coming down the Saco River way back in the day, and it's kind of pixelated, but Just really cool stuff. I look back at the work these guys did. Keep in mind, they're standing on a river, right? They're standing on logs floating in the river, and they're working away, keeping those logs moving and keeping them from piling up and causing a log jam. This is a more recent image here, and I could tell it's more recent by that steel bridge, but also by how all that lumber is cut really short. Those are all 4-foot lengths, and that's all lumber that would have been coming down the river to a paper mill. I'm sorry, they would use those 4-foot lengths for paper mill. That's called boltwood when it's cut to 4 feet in length. And then here we go. Here's some more guys on the Machias River, I believe, moving pine logs, tree length logs down the river, and you can see them using the pick poles there to keep that wood moving and keep that jam from forming on a corner in the river. And you'll see that in the movie we watch for the next couple classes. Just really cool, amazing footage. I can't come back to it enough. It's a part of Maine's history that's so ingrained in who we are. That often gets overlooked. The foods these guys were fed that we still eat today, things like baked beans and all kinds of stuff that are very traditional Maine foods. And then I couldn't let you go today without mentioning the Lombard log hauler. This is just a cool story. This was the world's first ever tracked vehicle, and you can see down in here the tracks that would have run this vehicle. This is essentially the predecessor to all modern tanks. Any vehicle that runs on tracks. This is the first one, and it was invented in Waterville, Maine, people. Waterville, Maine, the first ever tracked vehicle. And it was a steam-powered machine at first, and eventually moved on to diesel or coal and diesel powered and things like that. But if we look here, that little rectangle, little box on the very front is where the guy who steered would have ridden. There would have been a dude sitting in there, and he would have been steering in the front, with the guy, the engineer in the back, feeding the fuel into the steam engine and keeping everything running. But look at that giant chain of logs coming down that frozen trail. You could not move that much wood with a horse, and you can't move it as far as you could with the Lombard log hauler. So this machine allowed us to cut wood further from lakes and streams and really cut more wood, and it was the first step in kind of mechanizing these lumber operations in the Maine woods. So the Lombard log hauler, they'll actually show you one in the video we'll watch next class as well. That's called Stump to Ship. That's going to be really cool. I think you guys will enjoy that. But yeah, so I really appreciate you tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed just a quick glimpse at some of Maine's history. We'll take this week and we'll look at kind of the past, and next week we'll look at kind of present methods of wood cutting and logging and some of the ways we measure trees as well. So hoping everybody's doing great out there. If you have any questions, anything you need, any concerns, shoot me an email.